I've kicked off record to cloud.
Yes, please.
I will share. So hold on, I'm going to share.
I'll put myself on mute, and if I need to get your attention, I'll wave a card of red.
Okay, that sounds good. Now, a question, John. Can you see my slide, or are you seeing my screen with the slide controls on?
Just the slide.
Good, okay. The slide is what I wanted the answer to be, so that's perfect. Okay, I'm going to kick off, just conscious of time because it's 11:04. And I suppose this is, the whole idea about this is try and make this reasonably informal. It's not based on, you know, I'm not an academic expert on measurement, although I've been using measurement for years in various guises, in various organizations. Doing measurement well is not about, I suppose, what I would regard as some kind of theoretical approach to it. This is based on experiential use of measurement in large organizations and a few small ones. What I'm going to give you is some ideas, a few bits of toolkit, and hopefully some words of, I suppose, warning or concern or alert for you to just think about as you're using measures in organizations. So there's some questions in there, some provocation. If you want to sort of pipe up, please take yourself off mute. If you're not actually making a point or adding to the discussion at time, please put yourself on mute so that we don't get any unscheduled interruptions from dogs, children, cats, kettles, fire alarms, whatever you choose to notice. Hold on, just one more admittance to do. Right, okay, so doing measurement well. Let me just start off with some questions, I guess. We might pick up on some of these questions as we go through, but I think, you know, it's worth noting that measurement is everywhere, and I didn't put it on the slide, but from my experience, I note that measurement is possibly the most emotional subject I've come across in my entire career. It seems emotional in organizations, it seems emotional in society, and at the moment it certainly is emotional from an epidemiological perspective, and certainly a wider social and economic perspective. And I suppose we could ask ourselves lots of questions. What is measurement? What sort of things do we measure? Why do we measure them? I think is a really, really interesting question. I'm going to deal with a certain aspect of how do we measure, so that a lot of this presentation will be focused on aspects of how, and a little bit of the approaches of consequences, but I'm going to sort of deal with a little bit about what is measurement to kind of kick us off, if you like. But bear these questions in mind as we go through the session, because I think they're useful things for you to be asking yourselves as you work in organizations or help others in organizations with the thorny subject of measurement and what it is, how it works. So sort of on we go, I think, into the heart of it. So I'm going to pop in a tricky word here. So measurement I regard as being a key aspect of homeostasis, which is the whole sort of biological mechanism of trying to maintain things as they are or within some range of how they should be. So we can adapt this concept from the natural world to explain why measurement is important to operation and for lots of organisms, whether that's an organization or whether you're an amoeba, to survival. Effectively, and I've sort of this little picture as a cycle, I think is a really good one to bear in mind. So you can regard all aspects of you know, homeostasis as being sort of a stimulus. You get some deviation from a set point, and that could be deviation that is variety, i.e. getting something different than what you expected, or variation, i.e. that a level being something different from what you expected. And in the amoeba's world, that could be, oh, the temperature seems to have gone up a bit. Or in our world, it could be, hold on, a whole bunch of people are getting sick of something which we've never seen before. That's new variety. And then, of course, we tend to proceed to sort of start measuring, well, how much is going on of this? And then we start picking up variation. So measurement is interesting. It doesn't always have a scale to start with. In some cases, it never has a scale at all. And we tend to, as human beings, impose scales on things. So, for example, if you ever watched 24 Hours in A&E, they have a thing called GCS, which is the Glasgow Coma scale, consciousness scale, sorry. And that's all about, we have put a set of numbers around a thing to do with consciousness. But actually, consciousness is much more of a continuum. So, and some aspects of algebraic measurement don't actually rely on any scale at all. So in any system, anything could be a deviation, something you don't expect, or range from the point. And normally, the measures in our organizations or systems are some form of sensor, i.e. what is going on here. And then normally we refer that sense to some form of control center, whether that's a lizard type brain, as you find in most corporate organizations, or a higher order brain that you can find in other organisms. And the control centers will then try and make sense of this data to say, well, what is it? What is the sensor telling them? And of course, that entirely depends on their model of reality. So if their model of reality is skewed, typically the sensor will be skewed. So the control center is really, really important into what it does, how it functions, how rational it is, whether it has a model of reality that it's willing to recognize might not be correct, based on George Box's old dictum that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And then you come to that final question about then normally out of the control center, there is something that does something. So it might mean in an amoeba, sort of move my little tail thing to flick me along from warmer water to an area which might be colder water. Or in a corporation, it might be send out more vans to do this. So the effect is normally an instruction to either do something or not do something. If you're dealing with variation, you might go, and typically this organization do this all the time, I'm going to have a bit of a tweak with this, a bit of a tamper, a bit of a fiddle with the machine to see whether I can get it to do something. Or it might be, hold on, this is just normal. I'm not going to react. I'm just going to let it run because this is what normally happens. And then normally, as a result of the effector, some kind of response happens, and that could be the tampering that we've talked about earlier. It could be well, actually, something's clearly going wrong here. Let's go and have a look and see what we can fix it. Or it might be, actually, this is an isolated instance, say to a special cause, which might be a tactical fix, or it might result in a more strategic fix. And the expectation is that our response in some way counteracts or responds. So normally our response would be to balance rather than to amplify the effect of the sense. And then, of course, then we kind of go back to a point at which we're sensing again. But of course, as you know, in all organizations, this is happening thousands and thousands of times every day amongst thousands of people for thousands of different sensors, for thousands of different deviations. And of course, in some cases, hundreds or more of control centers and effectors and responses. So whilst this is a nice, easy little cycle to take a look at, of course, we know that in the real world, complexity reigns supreme, and this is going on all over the place. So just bearing in mind, so this is kind of like a model of thinking about measurement and how it works. So now I'm going to jump into a little bit about a very powerful aspect of measurement, i.e. sort of what is kind of sensing often there for. So, and I'm going to talk about the voice of the process. So, of course, in most organizations, being a form of system, they receive inputs and produce outputs. So typically, what a process does. And in so doing, they produce numbers on things that, that they have done. So management in this context becomes an element of prediction. I seeing ahead, looking at the pattern of what's happening and going, do I need to respond? If so, how do I need to respond? What would be an appropriate response? So you go back to the previous slide we were talking about. I have a sensor, I have some form of control center, I affect something, and then there's a response. But of course, in order to manage that, you have to come to some conclusions about the meaning of the sensed information, make sense of it. However, numbers are very rarely analysed in a way that leads to a good basis for rational decisions. And typical bad habits, and if you've read The Guardian or the BBC or any other newspaper of the last year about COVID-19, you would have seen us comparing numbers to other numbers and going, oh, that means something, without really understanding the model or the picture. And such comparisons this week to last week, today to yesterday, this year to last year, can be confusing because they often don't bear any relation to the pattern of overall what's going on. Also, we tend to compare percentages, so 91% is better than 90 without really knowing what that means. And we produce tables of figures that look a little bit like the thing on the right-hand side, which talks about, oh, here's a number, here's a bit of variance from the same month last year, blah, blah, blah. This is a sort of thing that appears ad infinitum in management reports. So what is the result of some of this, and what can you do about it? Well, let's just look at the second part of this story, is that there is actually a method that works. You can actually start looking at the numbers over time and say, well, what is this beginning to tell me about the pattern of the behavior of the system that I'm looking at? So one of the things that comparisons become, people do comparisons with low quality data and hence they're weak. But if you start tracking your data as some form of time chart, you can start looking for, the common causes, the things that cause something to go up or down within the normal variation. But you can also start sort of putting on your chart some notional limits. People call them control limits. I have a problem with the word control because they're very rarely actually about any real ability to control, but they are, in theory, a point at which you go, actually something unusual is happening here. It's not normal, and you should be looking to say, and you should investigate them. What's really scary over years and years, I've seen organizations that have responded to point comparisons from data point to data point. But then when something unusual happens and they go, oh, that was just an exception in the data, we'll ignore the special cause week. It happens time and time again. Or else they go and try and beat up the person who's doing the analysis and say, well, actually, something you did this week to measure was wrong, rather than going, what was really happening? So the beauty about the process behavior chart is it does allow you to include natural process limits, and it does allow you to ask questions about what happens when the data goes above or below any of those limits. So it allows you also to test this point about whether the process is predictable or unpredictable. So it's really, really powerful, and it's really, really simple. And do you notice the media using it? Not really. The only person I know who actually seems to publish any figures about COVID-19 within as a process behavior chart is Paul Hollingworth, who does so regularly on Facebook. And it's quite interesting to look at it because it starts telling you some interesting stuff about what's going on. So, when you start looking at you can start seeing that variation is pretty much within the kind of common cause, and it's predictable, it's within limits. So we can start seeing these points in the data in the real world, and you can see patterns emerging, and you can start seeing, well, where might this be going? And so in your environment, it's worth asking the question, how do reports really work? Are they just data? Are we just using point comparison? Do the reports distinguish between the normal behavior and anything that's exceptional? Is the data of sufficient quality to assess aspects of behavior and what the consequences of not understanding this? For this, I have to say, I pull up the really interesting Guardian article that has been running for about the last 3 months, which has been discussing the comparability of COVID-19 case and casualty rates across different nations, given that there is no standard for measuring COVID-19 cases or deaths. And yet they still make points about, oh, well, this means that such and such is happening or such and such isn't happening. And I go, well, hold on, half these countries are not measuring deaths in care homes or deaths outside the hospital environment. So how on earth is any of this comparable? How on earth can anyone construe that a particular result relates to the effectiveness or otherwise of anyone's healthcare system or detection or testing or treatment or anything? You know, data of sufficient quality is a very good question, and it says sufficient. It does not say perfect. So it says, is the data good enough to use? Yes or no? And that's a good question for those of you dealing with measurement to ask the question. Finally, it's worth asking of your environment, to what extent is that data and the analysis and the sense making in the control center? Remember, management tends to be in the control center making sense, driving continual improvement and innovation. Quite often it's just reading the report, putting it to one side, go, well, that was interesting, on to the next agenda item. Or let's go shoot the messenger, which is another typical corporate disease. Or actually, I don't believe the measurement data, let's wait till next week and ignore the special cause or ignore the trend that is emerging. So this is all about this idea of predictability, patterning, decision-making, and the ability for the organization to make sense of what is happening inside it and outside it. That's the important thing. It's not just inside the organization. Measurement, good measurement, is we're looking for signals outside that has an effect on its function. So I'm going to move on a little bit. So one of the things I think that organizations struggle with, because of course, if you have a good voice of the process, you also rely on having some good measurement. This kind of requires that you have some model for designing measurement for processes, and quite a lot of organizations don't. And this one I had to create, which is, it's sort of created from a number of different things, including the IDEF0 process modeling method, and various other things. But it comes to the concept that sort of says, well, if you're going to design measurement for a process, you should understand a little bit about the process. You know, what is the purpose or the transformation description of the process. Don't forget what happens inside it and who does it, because you should be understanding that from a general process management perspective. And then you can start by asking some things about the process itself. When does it start? When does it end? Notionally, what are those points where the transformation is said to begin and said to end? And then quite often organizations get quite good at measuring some aspects of input and output. But then they also need to start measuring, well, what about the inputs I didn't want, which is where's the rework demand coming from? So Seddon's Vanguard stuff is really good at looking at work I should be getting. And that's, you can ask very good questions about your process. Where's that work coming from? Why is it coming to me? And then there are other things you can start asking about your process. What control measures? So the controls are what allows me to see what's going on, what's live, what's happening, what's my work in progress, how much stuff am I dealing with inside the process? And you can at the same time ask, well, you know, when did that arrive? When did my start measurements apply? When did something leave my process? And then the bottom, you can then start saying, well, what goes wrong? So assuming that not everything, and it would be lovely if all processes converted all inputs without fail to outputs. That typically doesn't happen in human systems. And then you can start saying, well, how much failure do I experience? Then how well do I handle it? So how much of it am I able to recover back into my process? How much do I have to send somewhere else for someone else to recover it because what was sent into me wasn't fit to work on? So you can look at the activity of your rework and recovery. You can look at the demand back to other places, and you can look at how much did you manage to recover in kind of in situ. And there are two fundamental questions you can ask about all of these measurement criteria, which is the things that we need and can measure. But what's interesting is the debate which you get to the things that we need but cannot measure. So it allows you to distinguish, because quite often organizations are good at measuring what they can rather than what they should or needs to be able to. So there's often an as is versus ought to be critical comparison that you can make. And having done this with a few teams, it's scary how much they put in the red. To go, I really, really need to be able to measure this. I cannot. So the question is, well, what do you do instead? So sometimes they develop proxy measures. Sometimes they just realize that they're going to have a blind spot. Some of them actually, because they have a blind spot around things like the input area, develop pieces of process which actually do input quality checking, because they can't measure aspects of failure or rework or the rework demand returning. They do a lot of extra work at the front end of their process to mitigate for their measurement deficiencies. Now, if you start plonking that into the real world, and here's a real example on a real piece of process, I won't tell you where it comes from. Here's a real process, which was a process to validate customer orders, because the customer orders were quite complex, the product was quite complex, they had no choice other than to validate the orders to make sure they were deliverable. And basically a combination of order specialists and managers, and in some cases some things were kicked back to the customer to ask them to validate things. They had good controls for work in progress, orders in delay dates, and any backlog. They could measure some aspects of stage duration and activity task times as synthetics, but they had no handle on dwell times. So they couldn't tell you when an order came in how long it sat there before someone picked it up, and they couldn't tell you how long before they'd sent something through the next stage picked it up. They just had no clue, and they hadn't really thought about the needs to measure this. Interestingly, on outputs, they could measure how much work they'd done, but they didn't have any idea in this process of how much work that I kicked on that caused the failure downstream. Neither were they able to sort of say, well, actually, I couldn't validate a piece of information at the B end customer contact. They had some handling of the failure output by exception, but they couldn't tell you the number of ordering tasks that actually failed. And they had some idea of the defect action and the resolution time, but they had absolutely no handle on how many things cause a problem because someone made an in-flight change to an order whilst it was already being handled. No information at all. And not only did they not have an idea on the rework to do with that, they didn't have any idea about how much incoming demand there was of in-flight changes to orders. They just knew what was new, and they also knew how much stuff came in dead on arrival, i.e., I already know this is going to be a problem to validate because this is missing. I cannot work on this at this point. So this proved to be quite an interesting challenge for them. Probably that the main areas where they started realizing in this particular analysis they need to do something about the measurement system was no idea of the order pending or completion dwell times, and no idea about the in-flight change volumes. And the in-flight change proved to be quite disruptive. The dwell time debate questioned them about their synthetics, because they were basing resourcing of a team on activity task time synthetics, but the synthetics didn't have any relation to activity time versus dwell time. So guess what? The synthetics were wrong, and the resourcing was wrong, and they couldn't cope with peaks in work as a result of that. So this type of thing actually allows you to have quite an interesting debate about what measures you might want in a process. And you can do this at a meta level for the whole process, or you can do it at an individual. So if you've got a process model which is decomposed, you can actually do this activity at any level you like, at the end-to-end, or first level decomposition, or second level of decomposition, depending on where you think you have a problematic situation. Onwards. I think it's worth noting, and I'm sorry for the smallness of the text in this particular slide, but it was the only way of getting the whole darn thing on the one slide, that measurement is itself a process. Not only is there the process of using measures, which is towards the end, which is identifying patterns, trends, and exceptions, and then looking at results to targets if you happen to have targets in your organization, which most do, and then identifying the improvement opportunities. But on the left-hand side, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you really ought to be doing if you have a measurement system. Firstly, about reviewing it as a framework, So what have I got? How does it all fit together? What are my requirements? How do I prioritize and match those requirements to the processes I've got? How do I make sure that my measures are sensibly mapped to processes? Have I defined my measures and my counting rules adequately to use them? This is the question of, is the data good enough? And then if I need targets and I need benchmarks for some purpose, not normally, quite often because someone else has said you have to have a target, then how do I apply them? Do I apply them rationally? Do I have measures that are not subjected to those targets so I can use them for diagnostic purposes? So there's a little bit of realpolitik here. I don't like the bits about targets, but I know that in the organisation I worked in, they had them, so I had to figure out how to give some people sensible guidance on how to use them. And at the same time, I also recognise that all of those things, the definition, the counting rules, the development of measures, all had to result in a little activity down the bottom, which was train, process and measures users on how to use the darn things. Because if they're not trained on how to use measures, they will not use them well, as we have seen in the current political and medical situation. If you don't train people, they won't use measurement well, they will use it dysfunctionally. So it's just worth bearing this in mind, and bearing in mind every single measure and organisation is possibly somewhere in this process, and in some cases, more than one place. So you might have a current version of the measure you're using and another version of it that you're actually developing and defining at the same time to improve it. So this is a good way of just thinking about the life cycle of measures in your organization and how you need to actually give ownership to those tasks and actually manage them in a coherent way. So onwards. Okay, just before I move to the next stage, actually, let's just go back a slide, just pause for 5 minutes because we're kind of halfway into our time, and ask, are there any immediate questions? Otherwise, I'll move on to some of the other techie bits around how measurement works and how you can use it.
Tony, I flagged the question. I don't know if that's...
Hi, Benjamin.
Hi. I flagged the question in the chat. If you could go back to your nice IDEF 0 SIPOCI process context slide.
That one.
That one. Yes. So what's interesting to me, what I spotted from the start is you're not flagging learning measures per se, or leading measures. And it feels as though a lot of this kind of thinking is very solid when you know what the purpose and how to measure the value add of a process is. And we might sort of do a crude contrast between an open and a closed environment or system, I guess. So what I'm trying to get at is there a difference there between a kind of closed system process where you know what you're trying to achieve, and an open system process where what you're trying to achieve might be shifting and quite complex, and you might need to vary, you might need to think about measurements somewhat differently. Does that make any sense?
No, it does. And probably, to be honest, this diagram is probably more useful if you have a clear process in mind. So if you know what your process is, i.e. you have a definition of its transformation, and you know when it starts and you know when it ends and you know who does what inside it, then you can really use this ad infinitum at whatever level you want to. This is harder to use if you're not clear about what's in the green box. Because if you're not clear what's in the green box, it's really hard to go, actually, I know what's coming in, I know what I want out, and I know what's a defect. Because if your situation is slightly uncertain, how do you know what a defect is? Until it started happening. So if you're in a very soft learning environment, you may not even know what a defect, be able to distinguish a defect from an output at that point of life.
Yeah.
So if you're, if you're driving ambulances to patients, in theory, this should be quite solid. If you're developing a new socio-technical system for a deprived community in Latin America, this is probably not that solid.
Well, even if you're treating patients with a new disease that you don't quite know what the disease pathways or the treatment pathways or the treatment effects are, this you couldn't apply this purely in this way, could you?
You could apply this to some elements of the process where you knew you had that process reasonably well defined.
Yeah, good. Thank you. That really clarifies that. That's interesting to think about.
But
I don't know if it might be useful at some point, but probably not now, because I don't want to take too much time to open up the conversation to say, how do we triangulate that to that learning box of uncertainty, either around a good process, which allows the processes to do their thing, even though the learning and the complexity is happening around, or sometimes there's a part of the process which is the black box of uncertainty and learning within a fairly structured context, maybe like that hospital treatment environment. Perhaps there might be something for a broadening discussion at the end. I don't know, Tony, but.
And you can. I'll come to you in a second, John. Just Benjamin, just to finish the point. You can ask some of those questions in this part of the approach, where you'll say, well, what's in the framework? How much of it can I actually have mapped to a process? How much of it is softer? So some of your measurement requirements might be softer, less well defined, not necessarily hard counting rules, no benchmarks or targets applied. And you might be training your process and measurements users about different things. Your approach to pattern strengths and exceptions might be different in the softer environments than they are in the hard process space. So whilst that step about training the people who are using the measures is a good process step, what you actually do and exactly what that training constitutes will probably be very different than if you are in a widget production environment to, say, an NGO operation.
Thanks, that really clarifies it. Cheers. John,
hand raised.
Quickie, Tony, I think Ben Simpson's trying to get in, but I can't admit him.
Oh, that's a shame. Hold on. Right. I've clicked on admit for both of them, so hopefully Ben, you're in as well, because I've just seen the admission request on mine and enabled it. Okay. Any other hands raised or any other questions that you had, John? Okay, you're good. Okay. All right. Well, if there are no other questions at the moment, we'll move on and then we'll come back for some more questions later on. So we were at this process point. And one of the bits I want to focus on next is this whole piece about defining the measures and the counting rules. So this is all about what constitutes sufficiently good measurement, because if you don't get this right, it's quite hard to actually make sense of the data if you've not got any consistency to how you measure it. And COVID-19, as I said, is a lovely example of this, given that there are no international standards or conventions for case measurement, for casualty rate measurement in the World Health Organization or anyone else at the moment that they can apply to any country. And I really came across the importance of this developing a standard about 15 years ago called TL9000, which is the telecoms adaptation of ISO 9000, but it's different in that it has measures in it. And companies that are registered to TL9000 have to report the results of those measures to University of Texas at Dallas. And those results can be used to compare performance from one supplier to another supplier. The difference between how that might have been done in the old world and how it was done under TL was that TL chose to have clear, defined counting rules for every single measure in its system, which said if you were registered and you were applying TL9000, you complied to these rules. Your systems produced the data in this way. What you produced was actually genuinely comparable one supplier to another. And that led to some interesting questions about, well, what actually is a good measurement definition? How do you know whether you've got your handle on what you're measuring? So let's have a quick look at this. There are a couple of pages of this. Some of this I'm going to skim over because it's kind of obvious, but some of it isn't obvious and it can be quite tough for organizations to make sense of. So in defining your measures, some unique identifier, a sentence enough for someone unfamiliar to know what's being referred to, a clear statement of what's being measured, what is and what is not included, ambiguous terms to be fully defined, a purpose of the measure as well as the process. So why am I doing this? Are good or lower values, higher or lower values desirable? Quite often you see measures and you go, is high or good low? Or, high or low good? What am I looking for? Some relation to the processes to which the measurement is relevant. How am I going to segment and tier this measure? Do I slice and dice it by country, product, region? Quite often organizations don't specify these things. If you don't specify them, guess what? Your systems generally don't produce them. So if you don't get this right, you won't get the measures you want. Formulae. These are typically useful to have in some in some written out forms of, again, developers and your own management can understand what's being measured. What are the reporting units? Could be a simple count. It could be millions, thousands, percentages. As we know, looking at, was it Beagle 1, where we were measuring it in feet and someone else was measuring, or the Americans were measuring it in feet and we were measuring it in meters. Understandably, that didn't work out well. Finally, frequency is useful. Do I want to be able to take the data on a daily, weekly, hourly, monthly, quarterly? And are there any exceptions? And I've come across measures in some organizations where they measure an irregular period. People always assume maybe a week's Monday to Friday. Well, this was Wednesday to Tuesday. Someone chose to measure something. It's important to understand whether what's being measured. So these are all fairly kind of like bread and butter, simple ways to start defining. John, you've got your hand up again. Did you have a further question, or are you clear? No, he's okay. Hand up saying no, the hand's not up. Okay. Now, this is only the first part of it. This is kind of fair, like as I said, the sort of the motherhood and apple pie part of the definition. Where the chickens really come home to roost is page 2 of the definitions, which is where all the arguments take place when you're developing a measure or using it in an organization. What is in the counting rules for the numerator and denominator if you happen to have both? Of course, if you don't happen to have both, you just don't have the rules for, say, the denominator or whatever. What is it being expressed to? What data fields are used in the generation? What are the upper and lower bounds beyond which a result is suspect? I have seen organizations who've published a cycle time for delivery of a particular service in negative days. Negative days? How's that possible to deliver a service in minus 1.2 days? It's not physically possible. Something went wrong, but the measure wasn't actually defined to exclude those data points and throw out those results. Similarly, target points, if you must have them, it's worth knowing what they are. Now we get some key ones. The owner, who owns this measurement? Who's actually responsible for how it's defined, how it's used, how it relates to what's happening in the organization? And underneath that, who reports it? Do we know? So if I had a question or an issue with a result, who do I go to and say, hello, what does this mean? Similarly, the source and reporting, which systems does this come from? Am I clear that I understand all the places the data comes from? I've seen measures of this type which have had 20 to 25 different systems from which data is being taken at different times for different reasons. Presentation's useful. Like if you use process behavior charting, say here that that's what's required when you're defining the measure. Guess what? If you don't say it, your developers won't build it. Question 18, perhaps this should be question 2, action. Because if you can't answer this question, why are you bothering? A description of who acts on the data and what do they do with the results. Because if you don't ask that question, you can almost say, well, let's not bother filling in the rest of the definition, because nobody's going to do anything with the data. 18 is absolutely key. And the last 3 are probably technical, the last 2 or 4. Related measures, is this similar or related or commoned up with something else? Are there any references or extracts from industry standards? What's the status of the measure? Am I working on it, approving it, developing it, testing it, withdrawing it? Measures can have different statuses, and there can be different life cycle variants of an individual measure. And finally, just what's the version? So, really for me, whilst numbers 1 to 9, which are kind of descriptive, are really good, questions 10 to 18 really start helping you go, what is the actual blood and guts depth of what I've got here that I'm really measuring? Now I'm going to flick into something completely different. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about what's called triple vector measurement. And this for me is really useful, because I've had so many discussions with people about this kind of concept. And this was developed by Stafford Beer, and what he described was a way of characterizing activity and operation, the primary activities in any organization. And he said, typically we can sort of measure 3 things, and it's useful to bear in mind and ask the question, what are we actually measuring? So the actuality is what we're managing to do now with existing resources under existing constraints. Capability is what we could still be doing with the existing resources, but under the existing constraints if we really worked at it. So perhaps that might mean, for those of you familiar with SPC and process behavior charting, if we took out the special causes and eliminated the really silly things that we get wrong, where might we get to? And I had a really good conversation with a production manager in a cable environment who he was getting about kind of low 90s, and we did his sort of charting and said, well, actually, you're kind of like charting somewhere between the, 91% is your kind of mean. But actually, your capability, you could reach up to 98. And he went, well, hey, 98, that's really good. And I said, but actually, the lower end of your capability, when we look at what's normal, you could be, achieving as little as 84. And he went, what? 80? I can't do 84%. I get the boot. I said, but that's the capability of your process. But Beer actually does a really neat thing here, which he starts getting to think about. What can we do with the existing resources under existing constraints if we really work at it? So a lot of the kind of continual improvement thinking can feed really nicely into that. Well, what's it doing now? What's my level of variation around the current actuality? And what might I be able to do with a little continual improvement applied in this area? Now, then Beer gives you a third capability, which is a third category, which is potentiality. What could we do if we develop the resources and remove those constraints, but still operating within the bounds of known to be feasible? I.e., we know, for example, that it's not possible. We don't have teleportation, so we can't get an ambulance to a patient who's running 999 within 1 second. And given that the current expectation is around about 8 minutes. But if you thought about that, what would be within the bounds of what's feasible? And then you start asking a different question. So you're kind of transformational questions around your kind of process and what you might do to improve something or a situation really gets hooked into this one. What could we really do? So if you look at the sort of diagram on the bottom right, you can sort of, well, what's kind of tactical? What can I do sort of strategically? And then sort of, what can I then do if I really start planning how to sort of make a fundamental change? And then what Beard does that's nice as well is he actually creates 3 ratios that you can then use with those measures, which are the latency, productivity, and performance ratios. So you can actually common up some of the results about a particular area based on what's currently going on, what's capable, what your capability measurement might be, and what your potentiality. And bearing in mind, these might actually lead you towards having some slightly different measures of these things as well. So you might have something, looking at any situation that says, well, what's the current, what am I doing against the current milepost? What am I doing to say, look at the actual variation of, say, ambulance arrival? And then what am I doing to say, look at patient outcome as a different thing? So they're not necessarily the same measures, but with different points attached, they could actually be different measures of the same situation. What's clever, though, is that when you're if you are also measuring, have had some measures around capability and you actually looked at your actuality, you might go, well, actually, is there a special cause where a machine or someone did something well or badly? And the whole point about this is to try and create situations in your sensors where you send an alert to management. An alert message says, look at this and do something. The control center is now in session. Decide on an effector, decide who's going to take the response. It should drive some form of timely action, a correction of an error, a corrective improvement, or even an adoption of a good technique, because you might find someone who's doing something brilliantly in one place and you go, actually, we can learn from that, we can use that. So the routine response functions must be ordered to reflect this kind of practice. It should, an alert should mean something in the organization, should result in some action from people. So I'm going to wrap some of this up by thinking, I'm going to go back to my original diagram where we had sensor, control center, effector, response, and the stimulus that started it. And I'm going to give you kind of 4, I suppose, warnings or thoughts or concerns. Be cautious. Applying a target to a measure inhibits the sensing capability because you're always chasing the damn target. The 8 minutes for ambulance arriving at a patient is a really good one in that situation because, as we discussed on the last call of this, actually people focus on that and don't worry about, did the patient live or die? What was the patient outcome? Never mind the 8 minutes. Did they reach there in 8 minutes and 1 second? And actually everything was really, really good because it was a really good intervention, or actually did they reach there in 4 minutes, but actually didn't handle the situation very well and the patient died. Really, really important to distinguish between sensing and targeting. Be diligent about your measurement designs, second point. What are you measuring and why are you measuring it? What impact is it designed to have in the organization and what impact is it actually having? Is the control center doing something? Is it resulting in useful effectors and responses? And then into the control center, there's a be careful here too. What is being presented and how is that being presented? Are you using a sensible way of showing what's going on? Or are you just doing sort of numbers and a bit of point comparison and not much insight fed into what management is being taught about? So in the control center, typically, you know, like any brain, whether it's lizard or human or you know, or basically, or whether you're an amoeba, you need to know what's going on. How is the sensor information being presented to you? Does it come with a scale? Does it need to come with a scale? If it does come with a scale, what does the scale mean? If it doesn't come with a scale, what do you expect it to do? And then finally, just a thought about the response and counteraction piece, in that there's no such thing as a solution, in that all solutions to perceived problematic situations have consequences. They result in other problematic situations or other stimuli or deviation from a set point, i.e. everything's connected to everything else. So plan, do, study, act is really helpful here, but probably isn't the entirety. But let's face it, how many organizations don't even apply even a notional concept of plan, do, study, act to their use of how measurement is used in a situation and in their institution? So there is more. There's a nice article that Alan Clark put together that I contributed to, which is around what's called decisionology. That went into the CQI's website. You can go and find that. There are more resources on the Deming Alliance page if you would like to continue exploring this subject. And of course, there'll probably be more discussions within Deming Alliance and SAO and various other organizations who are interested in subject to measurement. So at that point, I'm going to stop and we have about 8 minutes for any questions.
Oh, my doorbell's just gone, so take another question first.
Okay.
David Anker, can I ask a question if you don't mind?
Of course.
Sure, this is really intriguing. Thanks very much for running us through this. It's quite timely that this came up because we're working, it's Light for Solutions is the name of the company, and we're looking at developing a measurement science MSc, potentially with, I won't tell you who it is yet, but a fairly well-known executive learning establishment in the north of the country. And the perspectives you give are slightly different from some of the things that we have seen working with our customers. But if I ask you, I've got tons of questions, but I'll only ask one for now. Towards the end, you were talking about the way ambulances, arriving at the scene in 8 minutes, or the equivalent in an emergency department is, are you seen within 4 hours, blah, blah, blah. And I just wonder if you have an opinion about the types of measurement. We've seen a fundamental difference in types of measurement into two classes. One we would call measurement, which you're doing in order to learn, understand, and improve, or performance management, if you want to use that term. And there are other types of measurement which we classified as performance reporting, which are absolutely useless in terms of improving, but are typically imposed by organizations like regulators. Every regulator uses these reporting measures. And the difference, just to make it clear, is instead of actually the time that you're seeing in an emergency within 4 hours, that's a reporting measure, and you can either pass or fail. It's a pass-fail measure, and it's useless in terms of really understanding. What's much more useful, we find, we call this a learning or a performance management measure, is throughput time. So I just wonder if you had any opinion on this way in which we're looking at measurement. Is that a useful way, do you think, or do you think that's confusing, or what?
I think there are lots of different ways of looking at this because potentially, I suppose I take the view that all measurement is reportable. Now, having asked that, there's also an interesting question about what is the purpose of the reporting, which is kind of back to my thing in the, if I go back to this one about the action, who acts on the data and what do they do with the results is a really darn good question. Because if you can't do anything with and we reached 91%, then what was the point of doing the measurement? And we should be going back in those environments and saying, well, actually, you know what? Go back and look at the framework. What are we doing here? And there are really interesting questions about measurement frameworks. So the disease of the balanced scorecard is one of the problems I've come across, where people say, oh, well, we have a balanced scorecard, but actually it's not balanced. It's got mostly financial measures in it, and it's mostly about, even the people measures are financial. It's got very little learning and growth. The process measures tends to be, again, financial. And in the end, one of the things I started doing with organizations in this top left bit around reviewing the measurement framework was I stopped using the balanced scorecard with them. Some I used the performance prism, which is the work done by Andy Neely at Cranfield, which is really, really good stuff that's worth looking at because it's a much more holistic way of looking at measurement systems. But the other one I started doing was getting them to look at this thing. What's the difference between your actuality, your capability, and your potentiality? And that leads you into a different set of discussions. The other place you can challenge the sort of the output targets obsession is by looking at some of your measurement system in here. One thing that this doesn't necessarily show you was that in the green, I tend to label things that I need and I can measure. Well, quite often you'll find that actually you can even add another color to this, which is what are the other things that I measure that I don't need, but someone mandates that I must have. You could create another color, amber, blue, black, whatever the heck you wanted in that space. But I will also typically find that when I go and do this exercise with someone on a piece of process that they're interested in, it is not unusual for them to be able to come and say, I've got a stack of measures relating to this area here, particularly around outputs, which are to do with timeliness, but actually don't help me manage the process. So whether you use another color or you add to this particular model to illustrate that point, I think is a way that you can explore that. I've tended to use this probably because it helped people identify the things they wanted to be able to measure but couldn't, rather than the other thing. But I think your question leads me to think that perhaps we need something slightly different that says, what is it that I also have imposed on me but doesn't help me do my job, doesn't help the control center function? Does that kind of, I know that perhaps is only a partial answer to your lots of questions, but starts to uncover it maybe.
That's very helpful. Thanks very much.
Okay. Thanks, John. A good comment to measurement as a process. Barry, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I had to disappear just now. The doorbell,
Sorry.
and I'm here on my own. Yeah, I mean, fascinating session, and it would be really good if we could have another session in the future with looking at all the measurements that have been made just with COVID, all the misinterpretations, all the various graphs and things, and to have a few of us who in the know, explaining to people, some of the things that have caused often a lot of fear, that because the data was used in the wrong way. And in your chart, your table with you had about 20 things in it. I mean, the numerator rules and the denominator rules were fascinating, because we see that those have been manipulated in different ways. The one thing I would say is that with something like COVID, there is so much uncertainty. So when you've got uncertainty, my view is you should look at the different ways of measuring things. So you give the two extremes, and we don't see that, do we? We see the Ferguson model, which is definitely a worst case scenario. The algorithm doesn't include mitigating factors that may come in. We didn't really see the Oxford model, which I believe was much less scaremongering. And one of the things that would help with us ordinary people, understanding variation in measurements, is to see the range of possibilities.
Well, let's talk offline, Barry, about perhaps running an illustrative session for people about measurement in a real world situation.
Well, that's a real world one, isn't it? So I'd be happy to cooperate with one or two of you. I've been collecting data. I mean, there was a graph recently of a very, very animated graph of how to show why the COVID was worse than flu. And it took me half a day to unravel all the data and the source of the data to find out why that was terribly misleading. And that that took me half a day. So you can't expect ordinary people to not to
absolutely
accept what a graph or an animation is showing, and lots of people did believe that as that COVID is worse than flu, and it may be worse than flu. Well, we still can't be certain, but we need to see where there are flaws in the measurement systems. So I would be happy to cooperate with that. And one other thing I'll throw into the mix, because
apologies, Barry, because I'm out of time. So, let's talk offline about doing something along those lines. I think that would be really interesting. Yeah. I think I'm just going conscious of time, so I'm going to have to just sort of close things down and say thank you ever so much for coming and joining this. I need to disappear, so hopefully you all enjoyed that and that was useful, and that we'll see you on future ones of these. So thank you for joining. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.